From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
Turning a maligned political maneuver into a life-saving win. Plus, lawmakers just say no to a flat tax, but it looks like a game of whack-a-mole to figure out who's saying no when. And the story that's making national headlines, a new rule for who can use which public bathroom in Kansas, but who will check to make sure you're following the rules and how? That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week.
Welcome to Kansas Week. I'm Dion Leffler, holding things down here at the studio this week.
And I'm Pilar Pedraza. Dion's in my seat in Wichita because I've been here at the State House all week following the latest action as lawmakers try to wrap up the 2023 session. I said try because, well, they haven't really actually managed to do it just yet. They have, however, managed to make a whole lot of headlines, starting with one that's gone national, overriding the governor's veto on a bill that bans trans women from public women's restrooms and other women's facilities.
The last step in making it illegal for transgender women in Kansas to enter places like public women's restrooms, locker rooms, rape centers, or domestic violence shelters was the first order of business for the Kansas House Thursday morning.
One of the things I've heard is we don't care about kids, but we do care about kids. We care about girls, care about safe spaces for people.
What had been a long, hard fight among Kansas lawmakers came to a comparatively quick end on the House floor, despite the last-ditch efforts of a group of LGBTQ lawmakers.
You all gonna go and check the genitals of every trans child who walks into the restroom, or maybe just children in general, so you can figure out who's a male and who's a female biologically?
What on earth are you all doing in bathrooms and locker rooms that you feel that you need to regulate them and make...
With apparently little attention from their colleagues who support the bill.
What is going to happen is there's going to be much more harassment of individuals when they go into a restroom.
At first, it looked like Republicans had fallen short of the votes needed to overrule the governor's veto until they got one more yes from a member awaiting surgery miles away and convinced another to change his vote.
This is the issue that I've by far have far exceeded the number of phone calls, text messages, instant messages, emails to my personal and state accounts since I've served. Yeah, overwhelming.
Republicans now celebrating their win. Later in the afternoon, the House Speaker telling the Republican caucus getting the Women's Bill of Rights was truly the icing on the cake of all of the successful veto overrides this week.
Because it often feels that we have all these kids on our shoulders, that we're carrying them.
Now, even before the bill hit the floor, opponents say they were feeling the weight of this fight.
And this was just one of several bills that directly or indirectly impacted the transgender community in Kansas that lawmakers have been taking up. The governor vetoed all of them, but lawmakers were only able to override her on this one and another involving some other issues that included things like lodging during overnight school trips. And that's just the start of all the action here this week. Diane, so much to talk about.
Oh, yes. And thank you, Pilar. Some of this stuff we've been talking about on Kansas Week all session, and we're not done yet. Here to hash it out once more, we've got Dr. Russell Arbin Fox, political scientist from Friends University, and Sean Logging, the State House reporter with KWCH. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Glad to be here. I'd like to start out with Sean. Can you kind of just outline some of the impact of these bills that have been passed regarding transgender issues?
Yeah, of course. All of these, of course, have been faced with vetoes. We had the transgender sports bill, which was vetoed earlier this year. That was actually overridden here earlier this month and basically now becomes law. We have, of course, what's being called the Women's Bill of Rights, this one that deals with public facilities and things like that. This is actually kind of interesting because, of course, depending on it's not really a question of if, but when this will actually be challenged in court. So I think that's going to be a big question of, okay, what, if anything, the impact this law has is what the court decides, essentially.
The fact that these bills are going to be challenged in court is really important, and it's not just going to be state courts, it's going to be federal courts, and so that's going to change a lot of the dynamics. It's certainly going to change the scheduling of when we're going to see these lawsuits and how they're going to play out, and also the stakes of the lawsuits, because of course we have similar bills that have been signed into law at several states across the country. Arguably, I mean, it kind of depends on how you define certain terms, but arguably none of them are quite as extreme as this particular bill that Pilar was talking about, at least insofar as access to public facilities. But it's very likely that as these things move up the federal chain, you're going to get a couple of these lawsuits bundled together, and they're going to be taken a look at the district level, the appellate level. It's very reasonable to assume that sooner or later, some of these bills in regards to the access of trans citizens to public spaces, as well as their ability to identify themselves in the way that they choose on their driver's licenses and other related concerns, are going to have to be decided at the Supreme Court level.
And of course, one thing in this bill too is it really doesn't have like an enforcement mechanism for monitoring or actually like enforcing the bathroom portion or public facility portion of this bill. So that leaves a lot of ambiguity of just kind of what this law will actually mean going forward.
And that will also be something that will be part of the lawsuits, because some states are going to choose to enforce these laws in certain ways. Other states are going to be enforcing them in different ways. So now you have 14th Amendment issues in regards to equal protection of the laws and so forth. You could have potential privacy issues come up, but of course, because of the Dobbs decision, the relevance of the privacy precedent in itself is kind of questionable. So not only are you going to see a lot of argument about these different laws, you're going to see a lot of different constitutional concerns be brought up in different contexts as these laws get fought over.
Well, one of the things too that these bills do is they affect prisons and jails, and that your birth sex defines where you will be housed in an incarceration situation.
And in the state of Kansas, where we've had all sorts of trouble in trying to get our prison system to be fully staffed, talking about discipline issues, talking about space issues. This is just going to make things a whole lot more complicated for some people. I mean, I'm sure you're going to be able to find some people who are going to come forward with some extreme stories, and they're going to be grateful for the legislature settling the matter. But I think by and large, this is going to create more headaches for the people working in prisons than otherwise.
Well, and are there danger issues here? We have, we've seen many times that transgender people become targets when they use the facilities that are related to their gender.
Yeah, and of course, this bill goes beyond kind of, when we see similar bills like this in other states, they're largely focused on schools, but this one goes beyond that. They're focused on pretty much all public facilities. So, of course, there's been a lot of laws, a lot of bills introduced this year across the United States that focus on transgender rights and accessibility. And so this is going to be a big question, as Dr. Fox was saying, that the courts will eventually have to decide.
Okay.
And you're right to mention the point about, safety concerns. We already have, as trans individuals have become more visible, we have evidence about the way that, they have often been targeted and harassed. You're going to see different organizations and different groups, respond to this law in different ways in the name of trying to provide some sort of security. I mean, I'm wondering if you're going to see on the local level, certainly in some communities like Lawrence and others, a strong push to simply making public bathrooms gender neutral as a way to, try to get around the possible invasive elements of this law.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Pilar, veto overrides were a big part of what lawmakers have been up to this week, but they weren't always successful.
No, they were not, Dion. In fact, almost right out of the gate this week, the Senate failed to override the governor's veto on a flat tax bill twice, as the Senate president played a metaphorical game of whack-a-mole, trying to get his caucus in line.
The Senate voted 26-14 in favor of the bill, failing to reach the constitutional majority to override the governor's veto. The tax package accelerates the elimination of the state food sales tax to January 2024 and sets a 5.15% income tax rate for all taxpayers. Senate Bill 169 has a tax cut for every single Kansan, said Senator Virgil Peck, Republican from Havana, who spoke in favor of the bill in the Senate on Wednesday. It's good for Kansas. It's good for Kansas taxpayers. The legislature's tax proposal received pushback from Democrats who took issue with the flat income tax rate included in the bill. There's no backup plan. That was the compromise. I'm actually shocked that she vetoed it, Senate President Ty Masterson, a Republican from Andover, told reporters earlier in the week. The Senate took another stab at it the next day, but failed. The second chance came when Republican Senator Carolyn McGinn announced she'd changed her mind and would support the bill after checking on the impact it might have on future state budgets. That should have given the Senate the 27 votes needed for an override, except the Sunflower State Journal reports Republican Senator Rob Olson of Olathe that announced he too had had a change of heart and would no longer be supporting the bill. He said he just couldn't support it when it had so little for Kansans struggling the most. Today, with inflation that is going on, people are hurting, Olson said. I supported this last night, and I really wish I wouldn't have, because I think we can do better.
Now, Masterson almost immediately disciplined Olson by removing him as chair of the Senate Utilities Committee. This isn't the first time Olson has lost a committee chairmanship over his actions, nor is it the first time the Senate president has used that punishment against rebellious senators. Diane?
Well, Dr. Fox, I'd like to ask you, there's a lot in play here, and how much of this goes back to the Sam Brownback tax experiment?
That's an interesting way to frame it. You have had a segment of the Kansas Republican Party that has been enamored at flat taxes, getting rid of the income tax entirely. These fundamental restructurings of the famous, long-standing, stable approach to taxes within Kansas that helped keep the state on a good fiscal in a good fiscal place for so many years. Beginning with the Brownback revolution in the Republican Party, that small faction, has, often found itself in a commanding position and able to push through, some of these radical proposals. Look, there's always been people that have advocated for a flat tax because on a certain level it seems appealing and logical and straightforward. The problem is that the flat tax makes it impossible to create any kind of progressive system that it actually is fully compassionate to low-income earners, that allows those that have benefited from all of the opportunities available in the Kansas economy to pay their share. It also fundamentally just makes the state finances a little bit more precarious because you're dependent upon larger macroeconomic trends. I think that's the primary reason that some Republicans wavered when they took a look at this. They have different isolated concerns, but ultimately right now Kansas is in a pretty good financial state, partly as a result of the assistance of the federal government with all of the money that came out during the pandemic. There will be times when the revenues coming into state coffers are going to be more challenged by these larger trends. And if we have a flat tax that can't be altered, then that's going to make it very difficult for Kansas to satisfy all of the programs that needed to be fully funded.
Okay, Sean, what do you hear about this? Do you have a feel for what the average Kansan out there thinks of this idea?
Of course, like Republicans, when they were debating this, they made it no secret that this will benefit those on the higher end, the wealthier end of the tax spectrum, because when it comes to a flat tax, it basically gives them more of a tax break than it does the lower income. So, of course, it benefits those at the higher end more than it does the lower end. So, of course, that was a question in play during this debate, during this bill.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, of course, all along we've known that education funding would be a big part of this week. And as of this time, Pilar?
Well, as of the time we started recording this episode, the House had just passed an education and finance bill that included what opponents are calling vouchers, as well as several other measures opponents don't like. The Senate is just now, as we're recording, starting to debate the other of those two bills, while the House is doing what they call caucusing on it, where the two sides, the Republicans and Democrats, sit down and discuss it all together. But education advocates weren't waiting to find out what kind of compromise lawmakers might reach. They began their lobbying efforts against any voucher type of bill earlier this week.
33 years, taught in Shawnee Mission for 18 years, Blue Valley for 8. 10 years as an English and English speakers of other languages teacher.
9 years in education.
26 years as a public school teacher.
20th year as a public school teacher.
I've been a teacher for 32 years.
I've taught for 36 years.
This is my 25th year in education.
26 years in the classroom in education.
I was in education for 27 years.
This is my 19th year in public education.
Several former Kansas Teachers of the Year gathered at the State House Tuesday afternoon with just one thing in mind.
We ask for any funds that divert public dollars to private entities. We cannot support that. Number two, we ask for our Kansas legislators to pass a clean school funding bill as required by the Gannon ruling.
In fact, school funding is the one thing lawmakers have to do this week in order to end the session. These teachers aren't alone in seeking out lawmakers as they come back to work.
People have different opinions about public schools and funding for public schools versus vouchers. And so I expect that we will always have these conversations, battles, discussions.
And the lobbying has been especially fierce on social media, articles, posts, memes galore. Now, though, we're down to the point where all education advocates can do is wait and see. Diane?
Sean, I'd like to ask you, why is vouchers such a touchy issue here in Kansas?
Well, one of the big questions is just rural schools and what this would mean for them. We, of course, had a voucher bill or school choice bill, however you want to call it, here earlier this month that was failed to get passed because the concerns when it comes to rural school districts. Especially when it comes to the voucher bills that we have discussed this session as well, there's big questions about just accountability. How will there be checks and balances when it comes to just how this money is spent? Is there going to be any kind of assessments when it comes to if the money is being spent in a way that is actually helping these kids learn? And there's really no kind of those checks and balances in this legislation. That's been a big concern of public school advocates during this entire debate. And so that's been something that, of course, has been hammered again and again, has kind of helped to kind of decrease the amount of support that this has in the State House right now.
I like the way you put that, Sean, because it highlights a certain tension. So one of the long-standing complaints that you see coming from, the sort of conservative legislators that are really very sympathetic to vouchers is, the public schools aren't doing their job. We're not following up on what they're doing. I mean, certainly a lot of the language of the Parents' Bill of Rights, or at least the language that kind of surrounded that idea before it was kind of sunk once again, was this notion that, we need to be able to more effectively find out what's happening in the classrooms. But then with the voucher bill, you're introducing the possibility that public education funding could be diverted to institutions whose whole selling point is that they're not going to be subject to this kind of bureaucratic overlay. And, we're going to have a closer relationship with the parents that's going to make it unnecessary for, all of these burdensome regulations. And it is very interesting to see people try to negotiate between that. I think ultimately that process of weaving back and forth between these two different concepts cost them votes on both sides.
Well, when do you think we're going to settle school finance in Kansas?
As soon as the desire of the legislators to go home becomes greater than their desire to continue to fight over these particular principles. They know they have to do it. And because of rulings from the state Supreme Court, they know pretty well at what state they have, or what stage they have to do it. The only question is, are they going to have the votes to try to, force through something that may allow for some differences in how you get to that stage?
Okay. Well, there have been a few surprises, like the rebirth of a proposal that many thought was done for this year, the legalization of fentanyl test strips.
Yeah, they used a common technique that's quite often used this time of year and usually maligned for being bad policy, but it worked.
Legalizing fentanyl test strips is something many of the victims' families we've spoken with have practically begged for. But while the House has unanimously passed it more than once, until now, the Senate has blocked it. But lawmakers pushing for the change decided to use a technique called bundling to get past the blockade. They tacked the test strips provision onto a larger law enforcement bill that included things like legalizing date rape test strips and expanding the Attorney General's powers to prosecute theft rings that cross county lines.
On top of that, we're taking folks that manufacture fentanyl, folks that make it attractive to minors, and we're throwing them in prison. This is a serious bill with twice as much presumptive prison.
And there are members of the House who have been pushing for this for years, now celebrating this week as this bill is headed to the governor's desk, despite some members of the Senate who didn't like the idea, pointing out no law enforcement officers had testified in favor of the plan. They stood neutral on it. But enough senators were enticed to vote for it to send it on. Dion?
Okay. What is the potential impact of this? I mean, do you think people are going to use these, would use fentanyl test strips to test their...
So talking with the groups that are actually like on the front lines, actually working to address like harm reduction efforts on the streets, they say these are very beneficial. Like they point to studies in other states where they have had fentanyl test strips available and legal, where that actually helps to basically prevent overdoses, because when people test it and they realize there's fentanyl in it, they don't take that drug. And of course, another big impact for these advocates that have been pushing for this is they say it's another point of intervention where they can actually go to someone, talk with them, and actually kind of help to potentially get them into treatment. So it's another avenue for them to really kind of change someone's life and address someone's substance use disorder.
Okay, and Russell, talk a little bit about the potential pros and cons of bundling bills.
Oh, I mean, bundling bills drives me nuts because it's a way to escape proper oversight, and it's frustrating. But I also recognize that it has become a standard tool in the legislature. Most of the time, when I hear about another act of bundling, I'm just very suspicious of what they're sneaking through, and there always is things that they sneak through. You know, there's a tax bill that has just been approved that includes stuff that's going to be harmful to cities and counties across Kansas. But in this case, I recognize that there were people that, you know, because of particular issues amongst their constituencies, they were just unwilling to give it an up or down vote. But by bundling it together, they're getting through something that, you know, as Sean was pointing out, there's more than enough research on to show, you know, the appropriateness of it.
Okay. And finally today, one measure lawmakers are proud of, saying it will help save lives, is getting a chilly reception in Southwest Kansas.
Dion, liberal city leaders say they're disappointed with state lawmakers for overriding the governor's veto on a human smuggling bill.
They say the bill opens the door to racial profiling because it's too broadly written. They fear that they could be pulled over and accused of human smuggling for even unknowingly driving an undocumented immigrant around town. Lawmakers say they tightened up the language in the bill once these concerns were brought to them earlier in the session.
I read the bill and I don't see any specific information added to it, so I want to say that's inaccurate. The bill isn't necessary. Kansas already has a statute criminalizing human smuggling. The existing law already penalizes the recruitment, harboring, or transportation, obtaining of a person, and use of force.
This is primarily meant to address the U-Haul driver, the driver of the U-Haul that has 30 people in the back of it, or the van full of illegal immigrants that are being taken to a sweatshop somewhere.
And liberal city leaders say while that may be the legislature's intent, the bill can still be interpreted much differently, and that's what's got them so worried. Dion?
Okay. Russell, what consequences?
When I see bills like this, what I see are people that are, you know, responding in, you know, honestly, primarily a symbolic way. As was pointed out, you know, we already have statutes that cover these sorts of concerns. You know, the idea of, you know, human trafficking is something that they want to take a big public stand on, and so a bill is written that actually could be interpreted in, you know, ways that cause real harms. This is like the Born Alive Act. I mean, this was something that's already covered by statutes, but by putting that kind of language forward, you take a stand, but you potentially really complicate existing abortion law.
Okay, and whenever I hear that term, liberal city leaders, as we know, liberal is not a particularly liberal place in the state.
Yeah.
But we've seen sanctuary cities pop up when it comes to some of the immigration rules, and other cities, including Wichita, where we're sitting, have simply told their officers not to enforce certain laws. Do you think those are options for cities like liberal?
I guess they could always be that type of option. But of course, when it comes to a debate like this too, like one of the concerns that Governor Kelly raised when she vetoed it was just ambiguous language. And even though that lawmakers say they've tried to basically strengthen or try to simplify or better make the language clearer, there still is ambiguity when it comes to bills like this. And so of course it's up to interpretation. It could lead to a lot of potential consequences down the line when if this bill is actually enacted.
And how important is it to get the language right when it comes to,
Well, it's very important. I mean, again, somebody might feel that they have a real need, or they think their constituents expect them to respond to some kind of perceived need in regards to, a select issue. Okay, so we're going to talk about human trafficking, and obviously people recognize the harms of that. But then you start putting language down, and you've got to start dealing with issues of undocumented workers. You've got to deal with issues pertaining to all sorts of questions about just normal everyday interactions. I mean, they're talking about Uber drivers there. I mean, are these people that are going to be subject to the law? The legislature might insist not, but you really got to trust, I think, the people on the ground who are reading the law and wondering, could this apply to me? I'm going to take seriously the language of this, the city council person who is saying, I'm not seeing any clear way that would prevent a police officer from reading this law in this particular way. You really do have to be careful with these things.
Well, and one thing that you see a great deal of in communities with large immigrant populations is there are families, some people, some members of the family are legal, some members aren't.
Right.
Does that raise?
Well, of course, people are going to be worried. I mean, maybe we have relatives visiting, maybe it's around the holidays. There's any number of ways in which they could see this as a genuine concern for them.
Okay. Well, I think that's about all the time we have. So I'd like to thank our panelists, Russell, Sean, and thank you, Pilar, up in Topeka. And we hope that you've enjoyed our slightly different version of Kansas Week this week. Pilar will be back next week in this seat, her regular seat. And in the meantime, stay safe and have a great week.